We would like to send out a special thanks to the fun and challenging June's Journey game. Who doesn't love a good mystery? In the hidden object murder mystery game June's Journey, you'll awaken your inner sleuth and step right into a thrilling adventure set in the heart of the Roaring Twenties. Find your inner detective. Download June's Journey free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
June 11th, 1962, San Francisco, California. 35-year-old Frank Morris, 32-year-old John Anglin, and his 31-year-old brother Clarence Anglin attempt an elaborate escape from the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on Alcatraz Island. After sneaking out of their cells during the night, the three convicts enter the water in order to cross San Francisco Bay on a homemade inflatable raft, and an extensive manhunt fails to find them. While the authorities are inclined to believe the men drowned, certain pieces of evidence, including alleged photographs of the Anglin brothers in Brazil, suggest they might have survived, so the actual truth about what happened to the Alcatraz escapees remains up for debate. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special milestone for The Trail Went Cold, our 6-year anniversary show. I'm your host Robin Warder, and to commemorate this special occasion, I'm going to be covering one of my biggest passion cases, the 1962 disappearances of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, aka the Alcatraz escape. And since this is such a famous and multi-layered mystery, I've decided to make it a 2-part episode. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Vanessa Maez, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Vanessa. We've been holding our monthly listener voiceover contest for 4.5 years now, and if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions at the end of this episode. Anyway, this will be a little different from the norm for this podcast, since I've never done an unsolved mystery involving a prison escape before, but this might be the world's most famous prison break because the escapees were never found, and it's never been conclusively established if they died during their attempt or if they managed to get away clean and start a new life somewhere. As you probably know, during its 3 decades of operation, the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, nicknamed The Rock, was considered to be the world's most inescapable prison because it was located on a small island in San Francisco Bay. If you wanted to attempt an escape, you would somehow need to travel through over a mile of very cold water with strong currents in order to reach the mainland, and this is why the most troublesome inmates with reputations for trying to break out of prison were often sent there. But less than 1 year before Alcatraz closed, 3 convicted criminals, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, formulated a meticulous escape plan which required months of preparation before they broke out of their cells in the middle of the night and attempted to cross San Francisco Bay on a homemade inflatable raft. While some of their personal items would be recovered from the water, the convicts themselves were never found, and the authorities have always taken the position that their escape attempt was a failure and all 3 men drowned before their bodies were taken out into the Pacific Ocean. However, over the past 6 decades, some compelling pieces of evidence have emerged to suggest that one or more of them might have gotten away with it and lived the rest of their lives as free men. I first became interested in this story when Unsolved Mysteries decided to put together a special 90-minute episode about it, which aired in February of 1989. As a kid, I remember taping the special off TV and watching it so many times that it probably wore out the VHS tape. Covering this mystery on The Trail Went Cold is almost like a bucket list item for me, and since this coming June will officially mark the 60-year anniversary of the escape, I thought now would be an appropriate time to tackle it. But of course, there's a lot of material to sift through, so on part 1 of this episode, I will be laying out the basic facts of this case, and on part 2, which drops next Wednesday, February the 23rd, I will provide my theories and analysis, as well as some additional backstory on the history of Alcatraz. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now dive down a very deep rabbit hole and explore the unsolved Alcatraz escape. Our story begins in San Francisco, California in 1962 and involves perhaps the most famous prison in the history of the United States, the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The facility is located in the middle of San Francisco Bay on the 22-acre Alcatraz Island, about 1.25 miles away from the city and 2.5 miles east of the Golden Gate Bridge. Even though the island was first used as the site of a lighthouse, it became a military reservation known as Fort Alcatraz during the 1850s, and during the Civil War, captured Confederate soldiers would be housed there as prisoners of war. The island continued to function as a military prison for several decades until it was acquired by the Department of Justice. In August of 1934, the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was officially opened, and since Alcatraz Island was an isolated, rocky outcropping surrounded by water, the prison was nicknamed the Rock. Alcatraz was pretty much the working definition of a maximum security prison, as there was a ratio of 1 guard for every 3 inmates, and some of the most notorious criminals in the United States, including Al Capone, Mickey Cohen, and George Machine Gun Kelly, would be incarcerated there. Due to its isolated location in San Francisco Bay, the Rock had a reputation for being a truly inescapable prison, so it was an ideal place to transfer inmates who had a history of attempting to escape from other prisons. In its 29-year history as a penitentiary, a total of 14 escape attempts involving 36 different prisoners were made from Alcatraz, and officially, none of them were considered to be successful. The majority of the escapees were either caught or killed, with only 5 of them being unaccounted for and listed as missing and presumed drowned. 2 of these inmates were Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe, who attempted to escape together in December of 1937, and we'll talk more about them in part 2 of this episode. However, the escape attempt which wound up garnering the most notoriety involved 3 men, 35-year-old Frank Morris, 32-year-old John Anglin, and his 31-year-old brother, Clarence Anglin. All 3 of them were career criminals who began getting into trouble with the law while they were teenagers, but Morris stood out because of his unusually high IQ of 133, which placed him among the top 2% of the general population in terms of intelligence. Originally born in Washington, D.C., and spending a good chunk of his life living in Louisiana, Morris was orphaned at the age of 11 and would spend the next several years of his life bouncing around between various foster homes and reform schools and getting into numerous scrapes with the law. After stints at the Louisiana State Penitentiary and Florida State Prison for such crimes as burglary, breaking and entering, grand larceny, and armed robbery, Morris wound up receiving a 14-year sentence for burglary at the United States Penitentiary, Atlanta, but due to his extensive history of escape attempts, a decision was made to transfer him to Alcatraz in January of 1960. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, were originally born in Donaldsonville, Georgia, in a poor farming family of 13 children before they relocated to Ruskin, Florida, an unincorporated community located just south of Tampa. John and Clarence were described as being virtually inseparable siblings, but like Frank Morris, they started getting into trouble with the law at a very young age and did stints in various reform schools and prisons for such crimes as breaking and entering, larceny, and burglary. On February the 4th, 1958, John, Clarence, and their older brother, Alfred Anglin, committed an armed robbery at a bank in Columbia, Alabama, and stole around $19,000, but because they were averse to harming people and usually committed their crimes at businesses after they were closed, the Anglins committed this robbery with a toy gun. In fact, when one of the women in the bank fainted during the robbery, Clarence made sure to tend to her and gave her some water before they left. All three brothers were captured 5 days later, and they would each receive 10 to 15-year prison sentences for the robbery. John and Clarence would initially be separated and sent to different prisons before they both wound up at the United States Penitentiary Leavenworth in Kansas, but after a failed escape attempt, a decision was made to transfer the brothers to Alcatraz, with John arriving in October of 1960 and Clarence in January of 1961. Even though the warden was advised that it would be in his best interests to keep the Anglins separated, John and Clarence were allowed to be incarcerated in adjacent cells located in cell block B. The brothers already knew Frank Morris from previous incarcerations in different prisons, and they had also served time with another Alcatraz inmate named Alan West. Born in New York City in March of 1929, West was a professional car thief with a history of escape attempts, and after attempting to break out of Florida State Prison, he was transferred to Alcatraz in 1957. West and Morris were also placed in adjacent cells in cell block B, not too far from the Anglin cells, and the four men would eventually decide to collaborate on a meticulous escape plan. According to West, he first brainstormed the idea for the escape after he was assigned to paint and clean the landing located on the top tier of the 3-story cell block and noticed a ventilation duct in the ceiling which led to the prison's roof. The duct was constructed with a grill containing crossbars which were impossible to cut or squeeze through, but West realized that it was possible to unscrew the entire duct from its surrounding concrete support and remove it. Afterward, one could climb through the opening towards a large ventilation fan, and if it was removed and pushed out of the way, this would create an opening to climb out onto the roof. Another influential figure in the escape was a veteran inmate named Clarence Carnes. Nicknamed the Choctaw Kid because of his Native American heritage, Carnes had received a life sentence for murdering a gas station attendant during a botched robbery attempt in Oklahoma in July of 1943. After making repeated escape attempts from other institutions, Carnes was sent to Alcatraz at the age of 18, making him the youngest inmate to ever be incarcerated there. On May 2, 1946, Carnes attained notoriety for being a participant in the infamous Battle of Alcatraz, where 6 inmates took over the cell house by incapacitating the guards and grabbing some weapons in hopes of hijacking a boat to escape. After a 2-day hostage crisis, the Marines stormed the cell house, and in the end, 2 guards and 3 of the perpetrators were killed. Carnes and his 2 surviving collaborators went on trial for the murders, but while the others were sentenced to death and executed, Carnes was spared and instead received an additional life sentence before he was returned to Alcatraz. This was due in large part to the testimony from the surviving hostages, who said that Carnes did not actively participate in the murders, even though his collaborators had instructed him to kill some of the guards. When Frank Morris was transferred to Alcatraz several years later, Carnes befriended him and would provide Morris with a key piece of information for his escape plan. According to Carnes, during the Battle of Alcatraz, he had discovered an unguarded utility corridor which ran the length and height of cell block B and was located directly behind the cells. The corridor had enough heating pipes and water pipes that one could use them as a makeshift ladder in order to climb to the vacant top level of the cell block where the aforementioned ventilation duct was located. Once Morris and his collaborators used this information to formulate their escape plan, Carnes claimed that they invited him to participate, but since he was such a high-profile inmate who was always under constant watch, Carnes felt that escape would be impossible for him. However, Carnes had a job in the prison library distributing reading material, which he would use as a cover to pass contraband to the inmates, so he used this position to provide materials to Morris, West, and the Anglins to assist them with their plan. The escape plot was first brainstormed in late 1961 and required over 6 months of preparation. The utility corridor could be accessed by a 6 by 9 inch ventilation duct located in each of the prisoners' cells behind their sinks, so the foursome would use such items as discarded saw blades and metal spoons which they had stolen from the mess hall to dig around the edges of the ducts and widen the openings. They would usually do this at night, starting from when they entered their cells at 5:30 p.m. following dinner until lights out at 9 o'clock. Since Morris and West and the Anglin brothers were each in adjacent cells, they could work in alternate shifts in which one of the inmates would dig while the other functioned as a lookout for the guards. The group also took advantage of a time period during the early evening that was designated as the music hour, where all the inmates who had musical instruments could play them inside their cells, and this would help cover the noise of the digging. Another item they used to dig through the vents was a homemade electric drill that came about when West was assigned to repair a vacuum cleaner and noticed that it had 2 motors. West realized that the vacuum could function with only 1 motor, so he was able to remove the second motor without anyone noticing. Afterward, the motor and some shears which were stolen from an electric hair clipper at the barber shop were combined together into a makeshift drill, which was used to make closely spaced holes around the vent cover until the entire section could be removed. Afterwards, they were able to hide the items they were using for the escape inside the utility corridor. The inmates also created and painted some cardboard ventilation grates, which they could place in the ducts as false fronts after the real vent covers were removed, allowing them to conceal their work from the guards. Things eventually reached the point where they made their holes wide enough to crawl through in order to sneak out of their cells into the corridor, but of course, since the guards performed constant head counts even while the inmates were sleeping, they would need to find a way to conceal their absences. The solution was to sculpt some papier-mâché dummy heads which were constructed out of soap, toothpaste, concrete powder, and toilet paper. The dummies' faces were colored with flesh tone paint, and since Clarence Anglin worked in the barber shop, he was able to collect some human hair, which would be pasted to the top of the heads. After lights out, the inmates piled clothes and towels under the blankets of their beds and placed the dummy heads on the pillows, which could easily fool the passing guards while the cell block was dark. This allowed the inmates the opportunity to sneak out of their cells through the vents at night, and once they entered the utility corridor, they would climb 30 feet to the vacant landing at the top of the cell block in order to continue constructing items for their escape. During his assignment painting the cell block's top tier, West came up with the idea of intentionally spilling dust and paint over the side so that he could convince the guards to allow him to hang up some blankets over the area in order to prevent additional spillage. These blankets would then provide a convenient cover whenever the inmates went up there at night in order to manufacture and store their items. Over an extended time period, the men were able to acquire over 50 raincoats, which they would use to construct life jackets and a makeshift 6x14-foot inflatable rubber raft. Morris reportedly came up with the idea by reading issues of the magazines Popular Mechanics and Sports Illustrated, which were both available in the library. These issues contained articles about building homemade rafts and watertight sailing jackets, and they would be found inside Morris's cell following the escape. The seams of the raft were stitched together by hand before they were sealed with stolen glue and heat from the nearby steam pipes. The men also managed to procure some scrap wood, plywood, and nuts and bolts from the furniture shop, which they used to manufacture some paddles. While some of the raincoats the escapees acquired were stolen, others were donated to them by the other inmates. Legend has it that many of the prisoners at Alcatraz were well aware of the upcoming escape attempt, but not only did they keep their mouths shut and not tell the guards, but they also provided a lot of the necessary materials. For instance, an inmate named Darwin Kuhn, who worked in the kitchen, would claim that John Anglin asked him to intentionally break things so that a friend of John's on the maintenance crew would be summoned to the kitchen to fix these items. The maintenance man would then, quote-unquote, accidentally leave some tools behind, and Kuhn would covertly deliver them to John inside his cell. While they were working on the landing at the top level of the cell block, the escapees used the makeshift drill to remove the ventilation duct from its concrete support, and after climbing through the opening, they were able to remove the rivets holding the large ventilation fan in place at the top. Afterwards, they used some clamps and fake screw heads they had made out of soap to temporarily hold the duct and the fan in place until they finally made their escape, which was scheduled to take place on the evening of June the 11th. Well, after months of preparation, the night of the escape finally arrived, and it would be attempted following lights out and after the first bed check took place at 9:30 p.m. After Morris left his cell and went up to the landing to retrieve the dummy heads, they were placed in each of the escapees' beds, but while Morris and the Anglins were able to make it through their vents without issue, Alan West ran into a problem. Unlike the others, West had spent most of the time constructing items inside his cell, so he had never actually gone out through his vent into the utility corridor. When West finally attempted to crawl through the opening, he was disheartened to discover an iron bar embedded into the wall above the hole, which he did not even realize was there, and it was preventing him from squeezing through. While Clarence attempted to kick the iron bar off the wall to enlarge the opening, the group ultimately decided that it was too risky and time-consuming to get West out of his cell and left him behind. However, they did leave behind a smaller second raft, a life jacket, and a paddle on the landing of the cell block in case West was able to get free and wanted to escape on his own. West would later say that after a couple of hours, he did finally manage to punch through the opening and make it into the corner before he climbed to the top, but by this point, Morris and the Anglins were long gone. West grabbed the items they left behind and climbed up through the ventilation duct, as the other escapees had managed to move the large fan out of the way and climb out onto the roof. However, once West made it outside, he claimed that he noticed a guard in one of the towers watching over his escape route. Since the guard would not divert his eyes away, West realized that making it off the roof was impossible, so he decided to climb back down the vent and return to his cell. The escapees' original plan involved them taking their gear and running 100 feet across the roof until they made it to an exhaust pipe adjoining the kitchen and used it to slide down 50 feet to the ground. Afterward, they would climb over a pair of 12-foot barbed wire perimeter fences and head to the northeast shoreline. Even though the prison was equipped with a number of guard towers and searchlights, this particular location was a blind spot because some steep cliffs were blocking their view, so it was the most ideal place for the escapees to enter the water. In order to inflate their makeshift raft, Morris came up with the idea of obtaining an accordion-like musical instrument called a concertina. After removing the keys in order to prevent it from making any noise, Morris used the concertina as a bellows and it inflated the raft. At this particular point of the night, the water in San Francisco Bay would have only been about 54 degrees Fahrenheit, but regardless, Morris and the Anglins ventured out there in the raft, but what happened to them next has remained an unsolved mystery for nearly 60 years. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our new sponsor, June's Journey, as we are very excited that they are now supporting the Trail Went Cold. I think it goes without saying that anyone who listens to this podcast is obsessed with mysteries, and the fact that we've been doing the show for 6 years now pretty much demonstrates that I am too. But if you need to get away from real-life mysteries for a while and are craving a good fictional mystery, then June's Journey is the perfect game for you, because you can just sit back, relax, and let your inner Sherlock escape back to the glamorous Roaring '20s. This game will allow you to research for hidden clues to mystery after mystery across thousands of vivid scenes. And since there are new chapters every week, there's always a new case waiting to be cracked. I just downloaded and started playing June's Journey last week, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect since I had spent a great deal of time putting together our anniversary show episodes, and it was an ideal way to unwind. In this game, you wind up stepping into the role of an amateur detective named June Parker as she attempts to tackle the baffling death of her sister. Each level requires you to find hidden objects and clues in order to advance June's investigation, and you get used to the gameplay very easily and can master it within a matter of minutes. And it's also a very relaxing game to play with eye-popping visuals and very tranquil and soothing music in the background, so you don't experience a lot of undue stress trying to complete every level. It's such an enjoyable way to pass the time that you can wind up playing June's Journey for hours without even realizing it, and it's a very satisfying feeling when you manage to start cracking some of the mysteries within the game. I mean, as much as I love uttering the phrase, "the trail went cold," it's nice to not have to say it sometimes because you've solved a mystery. Indeed, there is a detective in all of us. Find your inner detective. Download June's Journey free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. The ruse with the dummy heads worked so successfully that the guards did not even notice that Morris and the Anglin brothers were missing from their cells until the first head count took place at 7:15 a.m. the following morning, and the dummy heads were discovered in their beds. The prison would immediately be placed on lockdown, and a massive manhunt was launched for the 3 escaped convicts, which involved multiple military and law enforcement agencies, including the FBI. The whole situation would be described as the biggest manhunt since the Lindbergh baby kidnapping from 1932. Of course, since Alan West was left behind, he was questioned extensively about his cohort's escape plan. West claimed that after they left Alcatraz Island, they were going to use their raft to paddle across the bay to Angel Island, located about 2 miles north. Once they arrived there and took some time to rest, they would then travel through a waterway called Raccoon Strait before they arrived on the mainland of Marin County. Afterward, the plan was to burglarize a clothing store to obtain new outfits before they stole a car and fled the area and eventually split off in separate directions. Now, for many years, the official position of the FBI was that no thefts were reported at all in Marin County on the night of the escape or during the ensuing 12 days, but later on in this episode, I'll be discussing why this position is under dispute. Well, the evening after the escape took place, the Coast Guard found a homemade paddle floating in the water about 200 yards away from the northwest side of Angel Island, and it matched the paddle which had been left behind in the cell block for West. 2 days later, a waterproof packet, made out of pieces of rubber from the raincoats, was found floating about halfway between Alcatraz Island and Angel Island. It contained a number of personal effects, including 9 slips of paper containing names and addresses, over 80 photographs of the Anglin brothers' family and friends, and a receipt for a $10 money order which had been made out to Clarence by his mother and cashed at the Alcatraz post office. On June 15th, a deflated life jacket was found on a beach beyond the Golden Gate Bridge, and several days later, a second one was found washed up near Angel Island, which appeared to have teeth marks on the valve. West said they had planned to use small homemade clips to seal the life jackets after they were inflated, but if these clips came off in the water, the escapees may have attempted to use their mouths to hold them together. Finally, on June the 22nd, a third deflated life jacket was discovered in the water about 50 yards off Alcatraz Island, but this would be the last piece of physical evidence to turn up. Even though no human remains were found in San Francisco Bay, the discovery of all these items made the FBI suspect that the raft had come apart shortly after the escapees left Alcatraz Island, and the strong outgoing tide caused all 3 of the men to drown before their bodies were carried out into the Pacific Ocean. The FBI's theory seemed to be validated months later when a Norwegian shipping freighter called the SS Norefjell reported seeing a male body floating face down in the Pacific Ocean about 20 miles northwest of the Golden Gate Bridge. The description the crew provided of the body seemed to match Frank Morris, and the clothing they said he was wearing seemed to resemble a standard prison-issue uniform from Alcatraz. However, the crew was unable to retrieve the body, and even though their sighting took place on July the 17th, they did not report it to the authorities until October, and there were also differing opinions about whether the body could have belonged to one of the convicts. San Francisco County Coroner Henry Turkle found it unlikely that any of their bodies would still be floating on the surface of the ocean over 1 month after the escape, but a number of coroners from neighboring counties disagreed with this assessment. Now, if you go to the Wikipedia page about this story, it's mentioned that Turkle felt the body might have belonged to a man named Cecil Philip Herman, who had leaped to his death off the Golden Gate Bridge on July the 11th, only 6 days before the sighting. However, if you go back through the newspaper archives, you'll find a bunch of articles dated from July the 12th of that year, which reported that Herman's body was recovered, so the Norefjell obviously wouldn't have seen him floating in the ocean on the 17th. But it's also worth noting that on June the 11th, the same day the Alcatraz escape took place, a man named Seymour Webb decided to stop his car on the middle of the Golden Gate Bridge before leaping off a railing. Believe it or not, Webb wound up landing on a steel girder located just 10 feet beneath him, but he decided to jump off that as well into the water below, and even though the Coast Guard immediately performed a search for him, they could not recover Webb's body. In February of 1963, some bones belonging to an unidentified male would be found washed up on shore at Point Reyes, which is about 30 miles northwest of San Francisco. The victim would be buried in a grave under the name John Bones Doe until DNA testing was performed decades later, but we'll talk more about that in a little while. There was some evidence to suggest that one or more of the escapees could have survived. At around 11 a.m. on the morning of June the 13th, 2 days after the escape, an attorney named Eugenia McGowan received an odd phone call at the San Francisco office where she worked. McGowan's husband also worked there and was known for representing Alcatraz inmates, but he was out of the office at the time. According to McGowan, the male caller said his name was John Anglin, and he wanted her to arrange a meeting with the United States Marshal Service in order to negotiate a surrender, stating, quote, "I want my day in court." At the time, McGowan had not yet heard about the Alcatraz escape and had no idea who John Anglin was, and when she pressed the caller for more information about why he wanted to arrange this meeting, he said, quote, "Read the paper," before he hung up. When McGowan read the newspaper and learned about the escape, she contacted the authorities, though she claimed that her office had never been in contact with the Anglin brothers or Frank Morris. The FBI set up a phone tap in McGowan's office in case the man called back, but she never heard from him again, and the whole thing was ultimately dismissed as a prank. The authorities had a hard time believing that any outside parties could have provided Morris or the Anglins with transportation after they broke out, since they did not have any known ties to California, and their known associates and family members did not seem to have the money or resources to travel to San Francisco and assist with an escape plot. In addition, inmates were not allowed to make phone calls from Alcatraz, and all their incoming and outgoing mail was carefully screened, so communication with outsiders about an escape would have been difficult. But there was a strange eyewitness sighting to indicate that the escapees might have had some assistance. Sometime between 12:30 and 1 a.m. on the morning of June the 12th, only a few hours after the escapees were believed to have left their cells, an off-duty San Francisco police officer named Robert Checky was smoking a cigarette at the St. Francis Yacht Club when he claimed he saw a white 30-foot boat sitting in the bay with its lights off. The boat was within about 200 yards of Alcatraz Island, which Checky found unusual since unauthorized boats were generally not allowed to be that close. According to Checky, it remained there for about 20 minutes before someone on board shined a spotlight or flashlight into the water, and a short time later, the boat left and headed towards the Golden Gate Bridge. Well, years later, when Clarence Carnes was collaborating on a manuscript about his time in Alcatraz, he revealed that one of the prison's most infamous inmates at that time, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, had assisted with the escape. Johnson was a major crime kingpin from Harlem, New York, who was often referred to as the Black Al Capone, and was serving a 15-year sentence on a drug conspiracy conviction. According to Carnes, Johnson had arranged for a boat to be in San Francisco Bay to pick up Morris and the Anglins after they left the island, and they were subsequently taken to Pier 13 in the Hunters Point district. Weeks later, Carnes said he received a postcard which had the words "Gone Fishing" on it, which was a pre-arranged code word the escapees would use to let them know they had successfully made it. However, no evidence was ever found to show that Bumpy Johnson played any role in the escape, and I do not believe it was confirmed that this postcard Carnes supposedly received actually existed. For his part, Alan West always denied that the escapees had any outside contacts who were planning to assist them. 6 months later, on the evening of December the 16th, another escape attempt would take place at Alcatraz involving a pair of convicted bank robbers, 35-year-old John Paul Scott and 31-year-old Darrell Lee Parker. The two men were working culinary duty in a storage room beneath the kitchen and managed to escape through a window in the latrine as over a period of years, numerous convicts had gradually sawed through the window steel bars until they finally came loose and Scott and Parker were able to make it outside. They soon made it to the water and were planning to use some rubber gloves they had stolen as water wings to cross the bay to the mainland. Their absence was not noticed until the following morning, and once a search was launched, Parker was immediately discovered on Little Alcatraz, a small rock formation located less than 100 yards from the island, as he had injured his ankle during the escape attempt and gave up the swim. While Scott was nowhere in sight, it wasn't long before the authorities were informed that an unconscious man had been found 3 miles away at Fort Point beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. The man turned out to be Scott, who had passed out from exhaustion and hypothermia during his swim, but wound up surviving when the current carried his body to land. After he was rushed to the hospital, Scott made a full recovery and was soon returned to Alcatraz, but while his escape attempt was unsuccessful, it did demonstrate that it was possible for an escaped convict to survive a swim through the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. At this point, the prison's cement compound buildings were facing serious structural deterioration as they had been eroded by prolonged exposure to salt spray and saltwater saturation, and even though engineers spent a couple of years and millions of dollars attempting to perform repairs, they pretty much considered the whole thing to be a lost cause. Alcatraz had also become the most expensive prison to maintain in the United States, as the average cost to house an inmate there was $10 per day compared to the national average of $3 per day for other prisons. So on March the 21st, 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy sent out the order to close the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary down for good, and all of its inmates would be transferred to other prisons. And as I'm sure you know, Alcatraz would eventually be turned into a public museum and become one of the biggest tourist attractions in San Francisco, which brings in millions of annual visitors every year. As for Alan West, After he was transferred between a couple of different prisons, he was released in 1967, but only 1 year later, West was arrested on numerous charges, including grand larceny and robbery. He wound up receiving multiple sentences, including life imprisonment, at Florida State Prison, and he was hit with an additional life sentence for murder in October of 1972 after fatally stabbing another inmate in what was believed to be a racially motivated incident. On December the 21st, 1978, West was taken to the hospital while suffering from severe abdominal pains and soon passed away of acute peritonitis at the age of 49. After being transferred out of Alcatraz, Clarence Carnes finally attained parole in 1973, but wound up being revoked on 2 occasions for various infractions, and he was sent back to prison. Carnes was set to be released in late 1988, but he wound up becoming seriously ill from AIDS-related complications and passed away on October the 3rd at the Medical Center for Federal Prisons in Springfield, Missouri at the age of 61. Over the years, the FBI would investigate a number of different leads involving the escaped convicts, but none of them panned out. In 1965, they received a tip that Clarence Anglin had fled the country and was living in Brazil, and the FBI even went so far as to send some agents down there to search for him, but they found nothing. The FBI would keep constant surveillance over the Anglin family in case John or Clarence ever resurfaced, but members of the family would claim that they received a number of communications which made them believe the brothers might still be alive. In December of 1962, the family's matriarch, Rachel Anglin, found a Christmas card in her mailbox in Ruskin, which was signed by John and Clarence. The card was not inside a postmarked envelope, and she would find more signed cards from them in her mailbox over the next 2 Christmases. Over the years, other members of the family would receive cards from unknown sources, one of which was signed Jerry, and another which was signed Jerry and Joe. According to one of John and Clarence's brothers, Robert Anglin Jr., he would sometimes receive odd phone calls in which he heard nothing but breathing on the other end of the line, so he wondered if the callers might have been his missing brothers. Until she passed away in July of 1973, Rachel Anglin claimed that she received flowers from an anonymous source on every single Mother's Day, and a very strange event would occur at her funeral. Even though there was an FBI presence around the event, a number of witnesses recalled seeing a pair of tall, unusual-looking women in heavy makeup and long dresses who showed up to pay their respects. They stayed at the funeral for only a brief period of time and left without interacting with anyone else, but since none of the other attendees knew who these women were, it was theorized that they might have been John and Clarence in disguise. In June of 1979, a movie about this story titled Escape from Alcatraz would be released into theaters, and it starred Clint Eastwood as Frank Morris. The film was a huge critical and commercial success, and on part 2 of this episode, I'll be talking more about how much it stuck to the facts of the story. But later that same year, on December the 31st, the FBI announced that after a 17-year investigation, they were officially closing their file on the Alcatraz escape, concluding that the 3 missing convicts likely drowned in San Francisco Bay during the attempt before their bodies were swept out into the ocean. All of the evidence the FBI collected was handed over to the U.S. Marshal Service, who would continue their own active investigation since the escapees' deaths had not been conclusively proven and they were technically still wanted fugitives. On February the 8th, 1989, Unsolved Mysteries aired the 90-minute special about the Alcatraz escape, which I mentioned during the intro. In addition to detailing the escape attempt and the history of Alcatraz in general, the show decided to perform an experiment to see if the escapees' planned trip across San Francisco Bay could have been successful. Robert Stack actually wound up sharing co-hosting duties with renowned long-distance swimmer Diana Nyad, and they showcased another endurance swimmer, triathlete Dave Horning, as he performed a swim through the bay from Alcatraz Island to the public recreation area Crissy Field, just under 3 miles away. A trio of professional kayakers would also attempt the same trip in a rubber raft, which was assembled out of the same materials the escapees used. Well, Horning was able to successfully complete a swim, but the kayakers' makeshift raft fell apart only about a quarter of a mile from Alcatraz Island. Well, ironically enough, on February the 4th, only 4 days before this episode aired, the Anglin family's patriarch, Robert Anglin Sr., passed away in Ruskin, and there would be reports of 2 men with beards showing up at the funeral home, looking at Robert's body in the casket, and leaving a few minutes later without speaking to anyone. Much like the 2 unidentified women from Rachel Anglin's funeral, there was speculation that these men might have been John and Clarence in disguise. The Unsolved Mysteries episode also led to an interesting phone tip at their telecenter from a woman calling herself Kathy. She said that when Clarence's photo was displayed during the broadcast, she recognized him as a man who lived on a farm near Marianna, Florida, whom she last saw in 1986. This tip would be corroborated by another witness from the area who thought she recognized Clarence, and a third witness thought she had seen a man resembling Frank Morris there. The U.S. Marshals searched the area and even brought a producer from Unsolved Mysteries along in case they found anything which could be filmed for an update on the show, but they could not locate any of the fugitives or the farm they supposedly lived on. In November of 1993, the Alcatraz escape would be featured on another popular true crime TV show, America's Most Wanted, which contained an interview with a former Alcatraz inmate named Thomas Kent. Kent claimed that he had originally been invited to participate in the escape, but had to decline since he could not swim, though he still assisted the others by providing them with materials that they needed. Since Kent worked in the prison library, he said that Morris asked him to order a Spanish-language book so that he could teach himself how to speak it. After they crossed the bay and made it off Angel Island, the plan was for Clarence Anglin's girlfriend to meet them on shore in the incorporated town of Tiburon, and she would subsequently drive them to Mexico before they escaped to South America. Some parts of Kent's story did check out, as library records showed that Morris did order and check out a Spanish-language book in the months prior to the escape, and an atlas was found in Allen West's cell, which had a page containing a map of Mexico torn out. But overall, law enforcement was skeptical of Kent's account, particularly after they learned that he had been paid $2,000 in expense money for his interview. As the years went on, Supervisory Deputy U.S. Marshal Michael Dyke would take over the investigation into the Alcatraz escape, and during one interview he gave with National Public Radio, Dyke stated, quote, "There's an active warrant, and the Marshal Service doesn't give up looking for people," end quote. Indeed, this active warrant is not set to expire until 2031, which is when all three of the missing convicts will have reached their 100th birthdays. In February of 2011, the National Geographic Channel released a documentary titled Vanished from Alcatraz, which revealed some new information that had never been made public before. While combing through the original FBI files, Michael Dyke was surprised to uncover a pair of teletype documents dated on June the 12th and 13th of 1962, which mentioned that a raft had been discovered on Angel Island. Not only that, but it stated that footprints were found leading away from the raft, but there was no record anywhere of a raft ever having been entered into evidence. These documents also revealed that a blue 1955 Chevrolet with California license number KP076 was reported stolen in Marin County on June the 12th. Shortly thereafter, a motorist in the city of Stockton, located over 80 miles east of San Francisco, notified the California Highway Patrol that 3 men in a blue Chevrolet had forced him off the road. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the official position pushed forward by the FBI was that no vehicles were reported stolen in the area in the days following the escape, but these documents seem to contradict this, and the theft of the blue Chevrolet was reported in some newspapers at that time. In December of 2011, Bud Morris, an 89-year-old resident of Rome, Georgia, came forward claiming that he was the cousin of Frank Morris and that he assisted with the escape. Prior to the breakout, Bud said he had visited Alcatraz several times to deliver envelopes of money to the guards which he believed were bribes. Believe it or not, sometime after the escape took place, Bud said that he met up with Frank Morris at a park in San Diego where he told his cousin they should not associate with each other anymore. This story was corroborated by Bud's daughter, Sarah Valdez, who would have been about 8 or 9 years old at the time and recalled accompanying her father to a meeting in a park with a male friend named Frank. However, I've never seen any follow-up on this story, so I have no idea if it was ever established that this guy was actually related to Frank Morris, let alone met up with him following the escape. But the most compelling lead of the past decade would occur in October of 2015, when the History Channel released a documentary titled Alcatraz: Search for the Truth. It featured John and Clarence Anglin's nephews, Ken and David Widener, whose mother happened to be their younger sister, Marie Anglin Widener. By this point, Marie was one of the few surviving Anglin siblings, and Ken and David decided to come forward with new evidence, claiming that they wanted their mother to finally learn the truth about what happened to her brothers before she died. 5 years earlier, Robert Anglin Jr. passed away and reportedly confessed on his deathbed that he made contact with John and Clarence after they escaped and managed to stay in touch with them until around 1987. Since the Wideners said they didn't trust the U.S. Marshal Service, they decided to contact retired U.S. Marshal Art Roderick, who had headed up the investigation into the Alcatraz escape for several years. Ken and David started off by showing Roderick the Christmas cards that Rachel Anglin had received in December of 1962 and the following 2 years. It had always been a tradition for the brothers to mail Christmas cards to their mother every year, even while they were incarcerated in prison. But since all outgoing mail from Alcatraz was screened, the previous Christmas cards sent from there were marked, whereas the cards that the Wideners presented to Roderick were not. An expert would later determine that the handwriting on the cards did match previous writing samples from John and Clarence, but since there was no postmark on the cards to determine when they were originally sent, this did not conclusively prove that the brothers were still alive at Christmas time in 1962. However, the most compelling piece of new evidence that Ken and David provided was a series of photographs which were supposedly taken at a farm in Brazil in 1975, and one of these photos showed two men who may have been John and Clarence standing next to a large termite mound. According to the Wideners, the photos were provided to the Anglin family in 1992 by a man named Fred Breezy, who had been a childhood friend of John and Clarence while they were growing up in Florida. Breezy told them that he had run into the brothers at a bar in Rio de Janeiro, who remembered him and decided to take him to a remote farm in the countryside where they lived and worked. Breezy said that John and Clarence allowed him to take photographs of them because they hoped he could show them to their family someday to let them know they were safe. When Breezy originally shared this story, his account was tape recorded by the Anglins, and the recording would be turned over to Art Roderick alongside the photographs. Roderick found this story to be interesting because when he was lead investigator on the case, he recalled receiving a phone tip during the early 1990s from a man who reported seeing the Anglins on a farm in Brazil. The evidence was subsequently taken to Supervisory Deputy U.S. Marshal Michael Dyke, who also heard a proposal from the Wideners. I previously mentioned that back in February of 1963, the skeletal remains of an unidentified man who became known as John Bones Doe had washed up on shore at Point Reyes. Decades later, the U.S. Marshal Service was able to collect a DNA sample from a surviving relative of Frank Morris, which did not match John Bones Doe and ruled out the possibility of the remains belonging to Morris. The Marshals wanted to do the same thing with surviving members of the Anglin family, but they were always reluctant to provide their DNA. However, Ken and David told Dyke that if he was willing to exhume the body of their uncle, Alfred Anglin, they could extract his DNA for testing. As you recall, Alfred had accompanied John and Clarence when they robbed a bank in Columbia, Alabama in 1958, but he was separated from his brothers after they were arrested. On January the 11th, 1964, while serving his sentence at the Kilby Correctional Facility in Montgomery County, Alfred was electrocuted after he became entangled in a power line while climbing out a window during an apparent escape attempt. The whole situation baffled the Anglin family, since Alfred was eligible for parole only a few weeks after his death, and he did not seem to have any logical reason to escape. When Robert Jr. traveled to Alabama to identify his brother's body, he claimed he was told by the funeral director that Alfred had been beaten to death. Weeks before this incident, Alfred had been visited at the prison by his parents and reportedly told them he knew where John and Clarence were and that he was planning to visit them after he was paroled. This caused the Anglin family to theorize that prison officials had secretly bugged Alfred's conversation and attempted to get him to reveal where his brothers were. They wound up fatally beating him to get him to talk, so Alfred being electrocuted during a failed escape attempt was nothing more than a false cover story. The Wideners believed that if a new autopsy was performed on Alfred and revealed conclusive evidence of foul play, the investigation into his death could be reopened. The U.S. Marshal Service agreed to the request to exhume Alfred and also used this opportunity to obtain his DNA. Since Alfred's casket was perfectly sealed, his body was well preserved, so a new X-ray was performed during his autopsy, and it showed no signs of injuries, trauma, or broken bones to support the idea of a beating. As a result, the medical examiner concluded that the original story about Alfred being electrocuted was likely correct. In addition, Alfred's DNA did not match John Bones Doe, so his remains ruled out as belonging to John or Clarence. The Marshal Service started investigating the story provided by Fred Breezy, who died in April of 1998, but there was some skepticism since he had an extensive criminal history and a reputation for being a con man. In fact, following the release of the History Channel documentary, Breezy's widow publicly stated that her husband liked to make up stories, and even though she recalled him showing her that particular photo from Brazil, he never told her that the two men were the Anglin brothers. During the 1970s, Breezy was part of a smuggling ring who transported drugs from South America and Central America to Florida. In fact, the year after his alleged encounter with the Anglins, Breezy was arrested after a plane he was piloting, which contained $750,000 worth of drugs, wound up crash landing into a watery area in Ruskin, and this earned him a 15-year prison sentence. However, Breezy's story did provide investigators with an intriguing alternate theory for how the convicts could have escaped from Alcatraz. During the tape recording of his conversation with the Anglin family, Breezy said that John and Clarence were evasive when he asked them how they made it across San Francisco Bay. However, Breezy then mentioned how while they were growing up together in Florida, they would take a rope and tie it around the rudder of a boat at the Alafia River, and when the boat pulled away, they grabbed the rope and allowed themselves to be towed away so they could body surf. When Breezy mentioned this, the brothers reportedly replied, quote, "That's the way we came across." Well, interestingly enough, according to an FBI document, 120 feet of electrical cord was reported missing from Alcatraz Island's boat dock on the night of the escape and was never recovered, which led investigators to formulate a new theory that the escapees could have stolen the cord and tied it to the rudder of the prison ferry. Even though the assumption always was that the three men would enter the water from the northeast shoreline and paddle across the bay in their inflatable raft, another FBI document revealed that bloodhounds were brought to Alcatraz Island during the search effort and tracked the inmates sent to a cave on the west side before they lost it. So this has led to speculation that the escapees could have paddled the raft in a circle around the perimeter of the island until they reached the boat dock. The prison ferry would make frequent trips back and forth between the island and the mainland in order to transport guards and employees, and the last ferry was scheduled to leave that night at 12:10 a.m. If the escapees tied the missing electrical cord to the rudder of the ferry and tied the other end to the raft, or simply held onto it, the ferry could have given them a tow across the bay. As you recall, Robert Checkey had seen a boat in the bay sometime between 12:30 and 1 a.m. at a spot which was about halfway between Alcatraz Island and the dock the ferry used on the mainland. So if this boat was connected to their escape, the three men could have easily detached themselves from the cord which was tied to the ferry and paddled over to the other boat. During the History Channel documentary, a facial imaging expert analyzed the photograph of the two men from Brazil and compared it with photos of John and Clarence Anglin and determined that their facial features were very consistent with each other. However, since the photo in Brazil was taken from a distance and the two men were wearing sunglasses and had facial hair, it could not be determined with absolute certainty that they were John and Clarence. In January of 2020, a creative agency from Ireland named Rothko collaborated with an AI company called IdenTV Limited to use their facial recognition software to perform their own meticulous analysis of the photo, and their conclusion was that these two men were most likely the Anglin brothers. There would be one final lead in this case to suggest that the escapees survived, though the public would not find out about it until years after the fact. In January of 2018, the FBI announced that nearly 5 years earlier, a letter had arrived at the San Francisco Police Department's Richmond station, which read, quote, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June of 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we made it that night, but barely. Frank passed away in October of 2008. His grave is in Alexandria under another name. My brother died in 2011. If you announce on TV that I will be promised to first go to jail for no more than a year and get medical attention, I will write back to let you know exactly where I am. This is no joke." End quote. The writer mentioned living in Seattle for most of his years after the escape before he relocated to North Dakota, and he was currently living in Southern California. As far as I know, the authorities never heard from this person again, and all fingerprint, DNA, and handwriting analysis performed by the FBI on the letter were inconclusive, prompting the U.S. Marshals to state that they considered the lead to be closed with no merit. If the Anglin brothers did not drown in San Francisco Bay and managed to escape to another location before they passed away, their surviving relatives are still hoping that John and Clarence's remains can be brought back home someday and buried alongside the rest of their family at Fellowship Primitive Baptist Church Cemetery in Hillsborough County, Florida. But over the past 60 years, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin had never been conclusively proven to be dead or alive, so the Alcatraz escape officially remains an unsolved mystery. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Until next week, at least. Yes, folks, I'm going to have to leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger, as this about brings an end to part 1 of our series. But I shall return next Wednesday with our follow-up episode, where I'll be providing more details about the escape and the history of Alcatraz in general, as well as my own theories and analysis about what happened. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Vanessa Maez for narrating the opening of our episode. If you've already entered our listener voiceover contest before, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you would like to enter and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I actually recorded a special bonus episode with Charlie, host of the Crime Lines podcast, in which we discussed a bizarre missing children's case from Spain about the disappearance of 10-year-old Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. In addition, we've dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss another classic case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1987 disappearance of Dale Kerstetter. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. Yes, the most recent episode I've done a commentary for is their infamous one about African fertility statues. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Kenny F. and Lauren M. Thank you so much for your support. Also, just wanted to leave another reminder that 4 months from now, provided that it's safe enough to travel, I will hopefully be traveling to CrimeCon UK, partnered by CBS Reality, the expert-led true crime TV channel. The event is taking place on Saturday, June the 11th and Sunday, June the 12th, at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London. The Trail Went Cold is scheduled to be on Podcast Row alongside more than 30 of your favorite true crime podcasters. There are limited tickets on sale now, and if you would like to get a 10% discount, please visit crimecon.co.uk and use our personalized promo code COLD22. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is COLD22 for a 10% discount. Anyway, I need to provide another special thanks to the two men who have been alongside me on this podcast 6-year journey. McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. We will finally conclude this series in our next episode, so I want you all to have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday as we present part 2 about the Alcatraz escape on our special anniversary edition of The Trail Went Cold.